Hey people, welcome to the Run Testers and to a new series of videos with our partner Precision Hydration, where we're going to be digging deep into everything you need to know about hydration and fueling your runs. Now in this first video, I'm about to go and meet Andy Blow. He is the co-founder of Precision Hydration. He's a former triathlete, he's a runner, he's a sports scientist, and there isn't much that Andy doesn't know about how to hydrate properly. So whether you're tackling a marathon or you're just looking to go on a longer ultra challenge, we're going to be digging into everything you need to know based on the science and the latest research for hydrating well. Let's go and meet Andy now. Hi Andy, welcome to the Run Testers. And to kick off, can you just give us a little bit of an insight into your background and expertise in, I guess, running, sports performance, and then with a focus on the hydration and fueling?
Well, I was a runner first and foremost, but got into triathlon quite early. I've pretty much recovered from that now, and I tend to run as my primary sport these days, but I learned about hydration the hard way, doing long distance running, doing triathlon, and particularly in the heat where I used to suffer terribly, and that was what sparked my interest alongside studying sports science, you know, to try and unpick the puzzle of hydration for athletes.
Okay, and so you've kind of lived this, and so along the way you've basically learned pretty much everything there is to know so far about hydration. I know you take a particularly kind of scientific approach to it, and so we wanted to dive in a little bit more to get your thoughts on some of the things that we can use in our own hydration strategies. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch on first was the idea of general hydration. I think we're all pretty good at sort of dialing in when it comes to race day and thinking about what we're doing maybe the night before and the morning. But what are your thoughts on kind of how our approach should be for kind of general consistency in kind of hydration habits?
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're not someone who's doing a load of training and really pushing your body and doing a lot of sweating, day-to-day hydration is really just all about drinking to thirst, listening to your body. If you give, there's lots of studies that show that if you give free living humans access to water, they'll generally drink enough to keep themselves fit and healthy. It's kind of a very innate drive. Where there's a bit of a disconnect when you start doing lots of exercise and training is you can do a lot more sweating, and you have to maybe take a bit more of a proactive approach. And I think for those of us that work and train, it's things like making sure that you're proactively staying hydrated when you're at work, in the office, if you're training in the evening. It's easy to sit there all day just drinking tea, coffee, whatever, or not getting up from your desk and drinking at all, and then you can hit training sessions a bit behind. So having strategies in place to make sure that you're reminded to drink during the day and that sort of thing is a good place to start.
And I guess a lot of people can get fixated on numbers around how much you should try, whether it's 8 glasses or a certain amount of litres with the sort of recommendations. What's your take? You just basically go with how you're feeling, is that what you...
Yeah, there's a lot of mythology about like how much you need to drink, and this kind of the 8 glasses of water has become part of folklore, but no one can really pin down where it came from and whether it makes any sense. And in reality, of course, it doesn't, because every body is different, every situation is different. We all need more fluid in the summer when we're doing a bit more sweating than we do in the winter. We all need a bit more or bigger people are likely to need a bit more than smaller people. There's no hard and fast sort of algorithm or metric you can use. You have to like run your own experiment of one. You have to test and retest and try different things. And I think hydration's got really confusing in the last, probably in the last 20, 30 years, with people, taking it to extremes, either deliberately not drinking loads and loads, thinking it's a very celebrity sort of driven thing, isn't it? I like drinking loads of water to look after your skin and all this, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a lot of intuition and a little bit of just being proactive and thinking about how your body feels after you drink different amounts.
So I guess the aim there is to come to sort of every session in a good hydrated state, and I guess throughout the day. But then when it comes to around the kind of specific race time, which is I think when a lot of people will start to really think seriously about hydration. Arriving kind of pre-hydrated, is that something that we should be aiming for? And I guess one thing I've got in my head is I see a lot of people on the start line or on the way to races chugging back quite a lot of water, lots of people stopping to use the toilets halfway round. It feels like there's been a lot of kind of media attention on telling us to drink a lot before a race.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how right that is, or where we should go with it?
Yeah, one of the biggest mistakes we see with athletes is over drinking in the build up to an event. So they maybe don't have fantastic hydration habits day to day, but they want to turn up because the big day, we've all invested a lot of money, time and emotional energy in like doing a best performance on the big day. And it seems to make sense that, well, I should drink a load more in the build up. But the thing we always say is basically we are not like camels. We don't just store away loads of water. You know, if you drink more, you can be optimally hydrated, but you can't be, you know, excessively hydrated. You can't be overhydrated, because what happens is your kidneys just are aiming to maintain homeostasis the whole time. They're going to kick out any extra water beyond a certain point. And if you just keep drinking, which is what a lot of people do, because you're right, at race expos or the days before, they're walking around with big 2-litre bottles of water and just drinking, you just start peeing, and you flush out minerals with that. You flush out electrolytes. And there have been studies done before ultramarathons in particular, where they've drawn blood from competitors just before the start and seen that sort of 10 or 15% of the starters have actually got signs of a condition called hyponatremia, which is where you've diluted your sodium levels down. And that's on the start line. That's even before you've started racing and sweating. So I think over drinking is a bit of a problem. And the way to combat that is to say to people, yeah, in order to be properly hydrated, you can use a technique where you take extra sodium with a small amount of fluid, like the night before and the morning of an event. Yeah. It's called preloading, and that can top you up. And the extra sodium in a drink helps to pull fluid into the bloodstream. It helps to hold it there, so you can optimize your hydration without going overboard.
But you're getting a balance there,
yeah.
Basically. You're keeping your body in balance.
Yeah.
I was going to touch upon actually that idea of sort of overhydration during an event. I do a lot of ultras, and one of the things that I'm sometimes not sure about, you know, 8 hours into a day, I can feel very thirsty, but I'm drinking and it's not quenching my thirst.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what the signs are when you're doing something like a marathon or maybe something longer, that you may be venturing into that kind of overhydrated state. So some of the things I had in mind, and I don't know whether this is true, but I see, you know, swollen fingers,
yeah.
Maybe a little bit of nausea, those kind of things. Are there signs we can all look for?
Yeah, if you're over drinking, signs can often be some of those things that you've said. You can start to blow up a little bit. That's a sign that what your body's doing there is shifting fluid from the bloodstream, where it wants to keep your circulating volume up, into the body's cells, because you're risking diluting the blood sodium levels. You'll probably feel a bit bloated, like feel fluid like sloshing around and not being absorbed very well. You may or may not be peeing more than normal. If you weren't exercising, you would definitely be peeing a lot, but when you exercise, you release hormones that reduce the urge to pee. So you might not actually always pee more, but they're good signs. Also, a little bit of those early signs of sort of malaise and fatigue and confusion that could be, if you don't know your body very well, could be confused with low blood sugar, yeah. But they won't be corrected by having a chocolate bar or something. It's like a weird, you feel very off colour. Almost, yeah. Some people describe it being a bit like a hangover. Yeah. You know, you kind of feel, yeah, I definitely had that in a lot of long distance races, and I would often wake up the next day, even if I hadn't been out celebrating after the race, feeling hungover. And I was straight, I needed salt, you know, to replace that. So they're all good signs if you're over drinking.
And I presume this is why, I mean, I've got a real bad habit for eating salt and vinegar McCoys or whatever. Yeah. I eat and eat and eat, and I can't quite, it's always a sort of craving for salty stuff after I've done those long events. Yeah. Presumably that's, again, a sign that I've got an imbalance going on.
Yeah, because the drive for salt is really, really powerful. We don't realise it so much these days because we live in an environment where we've always got access to salt, but kind of early humans and a lot of animals, like, used to move around and settle and migrate to places where they could get access to salt, because the drive to eat salt is powerful, because without it we'll die. So there's that, if you are getting that craving for salt after events or during events, then it's a really good sign you're not taking enough.
That's it, and that's, I guess sometimes that's why on ultras or other runs where you eat more kind of solid foods, people tend to reach for, they'll get to a certain point in the race when they start to reach for things that aren't sweet, a little bit more salty. And that brings me on to my kind of next question, which is when people are considering different hydration strategies for different distances, again, I think it's another thing. We see a lot of people maybe hydrating sort of fairly heavily for shorter distance runs. Could you sort of run us through a whistle stop of sort of maybe like a 5, 10, half marathon? What's the difference between how we should approach those hydration strategies?
So it's a good question, because a lot of people want the answer to hydration. How should you hydrate as a runner? You know, and the answer is often, it depends really on, I suppose, a few major factors, one of which is the distance and therefore the duration of the event. Another one is your kind of fitness level. Environment is really important, and the intensity that you're going at. And when obviously shorter events tend to be higher intensity, but shorter in duration. So a 5K or a 10K, for example, if you're going to get that done in, most people get both of those done in well under an hour if they're a serious runner, then the hydration is all about before and then recovering afterwards. There's no requirement for drinking during. Even in the hottest conditions, you won't really see elite runners reaching for a drink in a 10K. Or it's very unusual to see that anyway. And that's because the level of dehydration that you can accumulate in that time is kind of insignificant. So that pre-hydration bit becomes really important. You want to be on the start line, properly hydrated, and then you recover afterwards. Half marathon is that tipping point where you start to see, even in hot conditions, you will see elite runners who are doing it in an hour or just over an hour, just under or just over an hour. You'll see them starting to reach for drinks some of the time, but again, some of them won't, and you're at that point. I certainly was a pretty competitive half marathon runner in the past, and I would rarely drink if I was racing in the UK. You make the jump though from then, the next logical step is marathon, and that's where hydration and energy intake become critical. And you know, we're talking about this like in the aftermath of Tokyo Olympics, where it's hot and humid, and you saw like some of the antics with the drinking in that, and that's when, whereas if you do run, say, the London Marathon and it's a cold year, the fluid requirements can go from being really quite small to, in Tokyo, really quite high, and that's where you've got to individualize it a little bit based on those sort of circumstances.
And cold, I'm interested, cold versus hot, because obviously we all sort of get that. So when it's hot, we know to sort of up it a little bit. We change on the way you hydrate. Actually, in cold, maybe are we guilty of sort of then not tending to it enough because we feel like it's not going to require the same amount. But how does cold impact?
I think with cold, if you're up to marathon distance, as long as you start well hydrated, it's much easier to rely on your instincts when it comes to drinking, because you're unlikely to accumulate enough of a sweat deficit to get far behind. So as long as you drink what you feel you need to, or what you're experiencing cold training sessions tells you need to, you don't need so much of a strategic plan. And so we certainly see in our work with other like multi-sport athletes, you can even reliably kind of drink to thirst, as the saying goes, in longer events, 5, 6, 7 hours if it's cold, because you're not rinsing through enough fluid to make a difference. What I think matters in the heat is that when you know, like a lot of the guys that were running and girls that were running in Tokyo, they knew that they're only out there for just over 2 hours, or 2.5 hours for the faster ladies, but they know that they've got to start getting on the drinking early before they feel like they need to, because you need a plan to get in front of it if your sweat losses are going to be big. And I think that's a big differentiator. It's like at the extremes, it's like you definitely are going to need to have a plan when it's hot and humid. When it's cold, you won't not benefit from having a plan, but what you don't want to do is have an inflexible plan that means that you end up drinking too much.
And that's another point we hear a lot, and increasingly people sort of getting that in tune with your body and listening to drink to thirst. How would you advise people go about doing that? Because I think it can be quite complicated. There's a lot of confusing signals, particularly as you go longer distances, about what you're eating, what you're drinking. How do we really zero in again on getting that right?
It's a combination of doing a bit of research and a bit of scientific sort of investigation into your body, but then the most important bit by far and away is what we would call like organised trial and error. So a good hydration plan has flexible guardrails where it says, I know that in these conditions running this duration, I'm likely to need between 400 and 800 millilitres an hour. 800 being maybe what it's more like when it's hot and humid, 300 or 400 when it's cold. And then you go into it with a plan to kind of hit those numbers early on, hit the middle of those numbers, and then adjust it on the fly. And it's a bit like describing to someone who's a novice runner about how to pace themselves. Like if we tell you as an experienced runner to go out and run at roughly 7 minutes a mile, you'll be able to do that without the benefit of your watch and all those sort of things, or at least get fairly close, because you've got years and years of running that sort of pace in your background. If we said to you, drink appropriately to get yourself through a marathon. You've done 40-odd marathons. You're going to be able to you're going to be able to read the signs early to do it. But like with pacing, if you take a total novice, they're going to need very strong guidelines, because there's so many things that you're thinking about. The nerves are that much more, you're sort of much more zoned in. It's like being a novice driver. You can't take in the things around you. You just sort of death grip on the steering wheel and staring straight ahead. You can't see what's in the wing mirrors. You know, as a novice runner, thinking about you don't want to be running along asking yourself that question. Well, do I really feel thirsty enough to need a drink or not? It needs to be second nature. And so it's like building up the experience. It's the same as pacing. It's to a degree, it's a little bit like fueling as well. You've got to have a plan and learn to read the signals. And then on fueling, because this is one thing people will be doing it for the first time. What are your thoughts on whether you should do your hydration separate from your fueling, or should you mix these things? Yeah, it's another one of those age-old questions where people want like the answer, and there's not really one answer. But what I would say that is true is shorter and faster events where you just need a little bit of fluid, maybe some salts, but predominantly you need some carbohydrates. Then a traditional like isotonic type sports drink and a few mouthfuls of that is a good thing. That's typically what you see a lot of these elite runners having in a half marathon or in a marathon to an extent, is they'll have something that's roughly isotonic, maybe a little bit hypotonic if it's hot, maybe little bit hypertonic if it's cold, but it will just be a few mouthfuls of a strongish carb drink, because that's a really simple way to get simple sugars into the system and get them distributed. Where they become a problem, and you'll know this firsthand, is like a really long race in hot conditions. They don't provide the volume of them you have to drink to quench your thirst is so high, you end up gumming your stomach up with loads of sugars. And at that point, that's when you want to be hypotonic drinks, or water plus salt capsules or whatever you're using for your electrolytes, and then gels, bars, chews, whatever the energy format is that you like to kind of complement the two. And that way you can, we call those things, so we call like the fluids, the carbs and the salts the three levers, and you can pull those levers independently rather than having it all in one bottle, which doesn't always work. And could you just quickly explain the difference between hyper and isotonic? Yeah, so hypotonic is, so the tonicity of a drink is kind of like the thickness of it, and we're comparing it to your blood. And so an isotonic drink, which is the one that most people have heard of, is roughly the same thickness as your blood. So it's a jack of all trades. It kind of delivers a reasonable amount of energy. It also has a little bit of electrolyte in there and plenty of fluid. And it's usually about 6% carbohydrate solution. If something is lower tonicity than your blood, it's hypotonic, and that means it's easier and faster to absorb into the bloodstream, and it hydrates you better. The trade-off is it won't deliver as much energy per unit. If it's hypertonic, it delivers a lot more energy, but at the cost of not being as good at hydration. So that's why you see like the classic sort of, it's not a sports drink, but the classic hypertonic drink that people will have late on in a marathon is like flat Coca-Cola, because that's about 10% carbohydrate, and you're drinking that for the energy, not the thirst quenching of it. Whereas when you see people watering down a sports drink because they find it too syrupy, what they're trying to do is it's like a homebrew method of making a hypotonic drink. And so, and we intuitively do that when it's hot and when we're drinking large volumes, because you know that makes your stomach feel better. It's really interesting, because you can almost, deep into ultras or longer races, you can tell when you pick up a flat Coke or something and it feels too syrupy, and it's not quite doing what you need it to do. Then maybe you drink a little bit and then you're reaching for a cup of water or whatever. Some people obviously will mix it up. Yeah, for sure. That's why one thing we always say to people running in ultras is, it's great if you've got one of these pack setups where you can have 2 bottles or something. You have either your electrolytes and your things in it, but you have water in the other one, or you have carbs in one and you have water in the other one, because you can titrate it then based on what your body's telling you, and you can really listen to it. Because there are times when you would gladly like pour the sports drink on the ground, because you've just had enough of it and you just want plain water. Whereas other times, if plain water starts to like slosh and taste metallic and horrible, you might actually want the one with energy in. That's really interesting. Do you think that's a thing? Because sometimes when I'm running, I will definitely get, not bored is the wrong word, but I can't really sort of almost stomach the taste of water anymore. And is that just a sign that I'm having too much? I need to ease off? I think it normally is. I think it's a sign that your body is looking for something different.
Yeah.
And that's why understanding roughly how much fluid, salt and carbs you need per hour is such a powerful thing to have in your head, because as you're running along, you can be monitoring a couple of things there. You can be saying to yourself, right, this water's not tasting any good anymore. It feels like it's sloshing in my stomach a bit. I know that normally I'd need about half a litre an hour. But actually, when I look back, I've probably been drinking, I probably had 750 mils in the last hour. The thing to do there is not force more water in. It's like there's a clear indication there that you need to settle it down and let your body catch up, and then maybe start drinking again a bit later. But people come in all different shapes, sizes and mentalities, but a common trait with runners, if they're very diligent about things like their hydration and that is probably to err on the side of a bit more rather than a bit less. Yeah. And I think sometimes having the confidence to back off and not take too much in is powerful for your performance.
And I think, just touching on that personalisation, that's a really interesting question I wanted to ask. So, how there's factors that affect us differently. So I guess age and gender, and is it the more personalised you can get with this, the better. And that's, I guess, where precision hydration comes in. Can you just explain to us a little bit about the approach in the sweat test and what we do in order to try and really dial in what we need, to give ourselves more information in order to get that balance right?
Yeah, I suppose the easiest way to illustrate that is like just touching on my story of why it started, because when I was doing triathlon in the heat, Ironman distance, I was copying the sort of approach to hydration that some of my more successful peers had, and I was judging my numbers off that, and just ending up in the medical tent, ending up having a horrid time, cramping, like I was a real mess in a lot of races. And I was fit, I was really fit, and I should have been performing at a high level, and I was well off the pace. And so the discovery that led to me making a big change was a friend of mine who was a doctor did something called a sweat test on me, because he noticed that he thought I was losing a lot of salt, a lot of sodium in my sweat, because he could see it on my skin, on my clothing after races. We tested it and found that I lose a very, very high amount of sodium in my sweat. To put it in numbers terms, it's like 1.8 grams per litre, which is twice what the average person loses.
And just to put that in context, we've tested me as well, and my results were much lower.
Yeah, yours was about 700 milligrams per litre, so
it's a huge range.
Less than half. So you're a little bit under the average, and I'm like 2 and a bit times the average.
So even though we might go with the same sort of levels of fitness, we're the same age as well.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
We're going to be completely different in our requirements.
And I was effectively copying someone like yours strategy in long races, and just finding that the numbers diverged so badly that I was drinking too much fluid, not taking anywhere enough salt, and just falling apart. Now, when I had that information, and it was my friend Dr. Raj Jutli who pushed me to he said, you need to take way more salt than you're taking and probably a bit less fluid. When I did that, it was like night and day. It was a complete change. And so the personalisation around getting your electrolytes right, it's not going to be a night and day change for everyone, but what it is, it's if you're doing longer and hotter events, if you're someone who sweats a lot, if you're someone who's tended to struggle in the heat and that, it could be a huge asset to know these numbers, and then to sort of individualize. And I would say individualization, although it needs to be done in different areas based on different things, it's got a lot less to do with, say, gender or age or height or any of those. With this, it's all about the characteristics of your sweat. It's like, how much do you sweat and how much sodium do you lose? Because there could be a small female marathon runner who has similar sweating characteristics to me, i.e. a high sweat rate and high sodium loss, who would then follow a similar drinking regime. And we could have a really big guy who sweats very lightly and doesn't lose much sodium, who might not drink as much. So sometimes the outputs can be counterintuitive, but they really are based on understanding that sweat physiology.
And then how do the results that you would get from a sweat test enable you to, when you come to sort of putting product in your pack or what you're going to put in your bottles, how does that help you build a good strategy?
The way we describe it to people, to keep it really simple, is it's like trying to figure out whether you're a small, medium, large or extra large t-shirt. Because at the moment, historically, the sports nutrition industry has given everyone a medium because it's kind of easy to do that. And that does suit a fair number of people, but some people are small. Some people are large, or like me, they need an extra large. And if you're taking a small or medium and you need an extra large, you're getting left behind. So what we're trying to figure out is net fluid and sodium loss, very roughly, so that then we can classify you as someone who needs a small amount, a medium amount, a high amount, or a really high amount. Because what's phenomenal about the human body is homeostasis is like a magic balancing act that goes on the whole time. When you're exercising, you're sweating out fluids, you're sweating out salts, you're burning calories. If you put roughly the right amount of fluid, right amount of salt, and right amount of calories back in, that engine will keep going at a higher rate for much, much longer. And that's the aim of a good sports nutrition plan. And with the hydration component, it's just about getting roughly the right amount of fluid in, roughly the right amount of salt in, and you keep everything humming along.
And you've got options here. So you can, I guess you can use, and is this down to kind of preference in a way, however you like to consume it? So you can have, fizzy tabs in a bottle, or you can have water and salt tabs, or you can have other forms, powders in bottles as well.
Yeah, I would say that the formats are very much secondary to getting the right numbers in. There's a lot of chat on forums, and I used to get dragged into all this stuff about, salt tablets are bad, but these sort of drinks are good, and this and that. And it's all a bit overblown, because at the end of the day, in your body, it's water, salt, and sugar in the right proportions. That's what we're aiming to get in.
Yeah.
And whether you put that in a tablet form, a tablet in your bottle, a drink mix, or whatever, it doesn't really matter, as long as it agrees with you and as long as it puts the right ratios in. One of the difficulties, and one of the things that we've tried to address with precision hydration, is it's not very visible on nutrition packaging, like how much is in these things. You have to go reading the little tables on the back, let alone understanding your numbers. So we've got a lot of online tools, we've got the sweat tests, we've got very visible numbers on our packaging to show people, okay, well, when you know roughly what numbers you want to hit, here's a toolkit you can use to do them. So it might be a tablet, it might be a capsule or whatever, but get the numbers right is the key message.
And when it comes to the electrolytes, the breakdown, sodium, is that top of the list? That's the one that we should worry about first and foremost, the other ones? Because often in the different products you'll see wild variation in what the levels of sodium, magnesium, potassium, all these other things are. It's sort of sodium our guiding kind of number, really.
Yeah, it's the one athletes should be most interested in, because sodium is the one that we lose in the largest amounts in sweat. It's the predominant electrolyte in extracellular fluid, which is where your sweat comes from, and it's the one that varies the most between people. Potassium, calcium, magnesium, they're all critical in the body, and we do lose them in sweat, but in relatively small amounts, and most of the time they're just adequately replaced in your diet. So the number that varies acutely is sodium, and that's the one that we should focus on. So sports drinks that purport to be high in magnesium and that kind of thing do have people who are real evangelists for them, but that tends to be for reasons that maybe they're deficient in magnesium in their diet, or they need extra magnesium for another reason. It's not because they're sweating it out. Sweat is basically sodium and fluid.
And then I've got a couple of final quick questions, which are just sort of, one of them is cramp.
Yeah.
So I've tried to work out what causes it, and I think a lot of other people have who are smarter than me as well. I've only recently sort of started to experience it, but it's obviously when hydration, it's one of these things that sort of comes with people talk about hydration and salt levels. And what's your take on cramp and how to avoid it? Can we avoid it? What should we do?
Yeah, it's a massive controversial topic in sports science for sure, and there's lots of different theories. There's two main competing theories. The old theory, if you like, is dehydration, electrolyte imbalance causes cramp, and that's based on a lot of observed and anecdotal data, and a whole wealth of that data actually from workers in hot climates, from athletes, from all sorts of places. And there's not a concrete mechanism that's kind of locked down, and that's one of the criticisms of that theory. But there seems to be a trend where if you put people in a hot environment, exercise them hard or work them hard, and fail to replace sodium salts along with water, there's a higher prevalence of cramping. But it's fickle because it's not always easy to replicate, and deliberately taking people into labs and putting them in harsh conditions to cause them to cramp is like ethically challenging for lots of reasons. I'm not
putting my hand up for that.
Exactly. There's not many takers for that. Although recently there was a study done where they did give people different strengths of electrolyte drink, and they stimulated cramps in the foot or the calf, I think it was, by putting electrodes on there, and they found that the threshold frequency for cramping was increased dramatically, so it was harder to get people to cramp if they'd had a strong electrolyte drink. So I'm a believer in that being a valid theory, but I don't think it's the only theory that covers cramping, because we all know you can get cramps when you overstretch muscles or overstrain them, or when we see 100-metre runners pulling up with cramps sometimes.
Yeah.
They're clearly not electrolyte depleted. So there's this kind of neuromuscular fatigue theory where when you overwork a muscle or fatigue it, then that can stimulate cramping as well. So there's not a consensus, but we've written quite a lot on cramping. One of the most read blogs on our website actually is all about cramping and is worth a read if people want to know the full story. But I would say there are protocols that you can follow trying different things with electrolytes that can at least rule out whether that's going to help you with your type of cramping.
Brilliant. And we will put a link to that in the bottom of the caption here so you'll be able to find it, so you can go and read those blogs. They're really interesting. I totally recommend it. These guys go very deep into all of the things that you need to know about fueling and hydration. It's a really, really good read. Andy, thanks very much for coming on and talking to us about that. Hopefully you guys out there have got some more information now to go and sort of plan your hydration strategies. Where should people go in order to, they can do an online sweat test as well, so where should they go for that, Andy?
Precisionhydration.com is the best place to start. I would say the key things that people can do, they can do the free online sweat test and they'll get a little email chain following that up with some advice on what to do. They can read the blog pages on our website and sign up to our newsletter. We do a performance newsletter every week with these kind of topics covered. And we also offer one-to-one video calls for free as well. So if people have very specific questions that aren't covered in those other resources, just book a call with one of the team and we'd love to hear from you.
So we're also going to be doing a follow-up video where Andy and the team are going to be answering any of your burning questions about fueling and hydration. So if there's anything you specifically want answered about how you approach your hydration strategy or how to fuel any kind of race distance, hit us up in the comments below, and in a subsequent video we will be answering those questions. So get in touch.